This week we are looking at the Union in peril. So we're looking back at the issue of slavery, which we sort of come back to over and over in American history. These are our three objectives for 10.1. We have described a growing difference between North and South in their economies and their way of life. Number two, explain why the Wilmot Proviso failed to pass and why the issue of California statehood became important. And third, analyze how the effects of Clay, Webster, and Douglas produced the compromise in 1850. So far I have come back to the Missouri Compromise over and over, so we are going to be discussing a new compromise. This is what America looks like in 1850. So as you can see, we've just talked about Texas. Texas is now a part of the Union. They have also gained all this new territory after the war with Mexico. So California is already a state because of the gold rush. We had tons of people moving there, so there's enough people to make it a state. But some of these these are still territories. There's not enough people living in this area yet. Okay, so now we sort of have seen the U.S. has sort of taken over all of the western part of this continent. So looking at our first objective, we're sort of going to compare what's happening in the North with the economy versus what's happening in the South. Now, of course, this is something that we've gone over more than once, and it's always a good thing to repeat this. It's an important idea. So in the North, we have the economy is focused on industrialization and factory growth, and it keeps on growing and growing in the North. It seems that many cities have started to develop, cities like Chicago. New York is now an expansive city. And overall, we have a growing population. The reason why the population is growing is we have many European immigrants coming to America to sort of seek a new life. These immigrants, they're the ones who are working in the factories and in the North. And the Northern economy relies on this. The reason why the North has a strong opposition to slavery is not necessarily for reasons of equality. Many of these new European immigrants, they are sort of a source of cheaper labor in the North. Now, if slavery expanded into the North, many of these European immigrants, they would not really have a job. They wouldn't be able to compete with free labor. This is a major reason why the North is against slavery. Now, there are, of course, a few key figures who are against slavery for equality, which we'll talk about. But it's important to note that the North, the reason they're against it is for largely economic reasons. The South continues to rely on their cash crops. So again, we know that the major cash crop is cotton. They have not developed cities. They have sort of continued on with their sort of farming agricultural lifestyle. That lifestyle, it needs slavery. They would not be able to afford sort of agricultural economy without free labor. They have a fear that the North is going to destroy their way of life. So right now, many of the plantation owners in the South, they have sort of a good life for themselves. They're worried that if slavery is outlawed, that their lives would drastically change. In fact, it may cause many of these Southern plantation owners to go bankrupt or lose sort of the main source of economy in the South. Here's a graph looking at the members in the House of Representatives in the U.S. government. So as you can see, in 1800, we have 77 members from free states and 65 members from slave states. So even though members from free states have more, it's not that many more. But every 10 years, this number slowly increases. So first of all, the population increases, so that means there's more representatives in general. But second of all, we're starting to see a drastic shift between how many people are from slave states and how many people are from free states. What I want you to note is where is there the biggest difference between slave states and free states with the amount of representatives? And the second thing I want you to know is what is unusual about the end of this graph when we're comparing these numbers? So looking again at members from slave states versus members of free states. What starts to happen at the end? I'm looking at 1840s and 1850s. That's your first question. One major issue that starts to arise is the fact that America has now gained a lot of new territory that falls under the Missouri Compromise line. That is that line that divides slave states and free states. So for years, we had the U.S. sort of ignoring this issue of slavery, especially when it comes to the U.S. legislature. So they're trying to create an equal balance, but it's slowly becoming more and more of a problem. In August 8, in 1846, we have David Wilmot. He sort of starts a fight over this issue of slavery. And what he basically states is that no new territory should have slavery. He sort of comes up with what we call is the Wilmot Proviso. It's basically going to be creating a law so that there will be no slavery in any territory that the U.S. got from Mexico in the U.S. So remember, one of the reasons why we have Polk wanting to go to war with Mexico was because he wanted to expand slave territory. This proviso, the Wilmot Proviso, is basically saying we are not going to allow those new territories, which is Arizona, New Mexico, and California, to become a part of the slave territories, slave states. So let's look at this argument in a North versus South sort of way. So first off, the Northerners, they end up being angry at Southerners for not wanting to improve infrastructure. Now, infrastructure are things like roads, railways, canals, ways to improve transportation. Basically, at this point, the South is saying that they don't want to improve that because that doesn't really help the Southern economy. The second thing is that we have this idea of expanding slavery. They are worried that if these territories that were taken from the War of Mexico, if they are expanding with slavery, that eventually they will become states and and the South will have more political power in the government. Right now, the North is they have more political power in the government and they want to keep that power. The third thing is that it will weaken economy opportunity for free labor. So basically they're saying is all these new immigrants that are coming to the U.S. and who want to be American and who want to sort of help American economy and American politics, they will not have job opportunity if these new territories in what was used to be Mexico, if they are taken over by slave labor or free labor. On the other hand, the South argues that slaves were property. They argue that the slaves were not people, that they were actually owned by the plantation owners. And therefore, because slaves were property, they are protected under the Constitution. So they're saying that the Constitution, you have a right to expand and own certain types of property. The other thing that is worrying the South is that if this becomes law, the political power will shift to the North. So again, they recognize that if the Wilmot Proviso happens, that the South, they're going to lose more and more power in government. What ends up happening, we do have the House of Representatives passed the law, but the Senate does not pass the law. That means there is a division in the legislative branch in the U.S. It never ends up becoming a law. Okay, but it is showing the first sort of political change to slavery. We start seeing that people want this change. We have another issue with California becoming a state. Now, the reason why California jumps being a territory is because of the gold rush. Now, we looked at the gold rush last week. So many people moved to California that they didn't really go through the territory phase of becoming a state, and they immediately became a state because of the amount of population. Now, when California became a state, they adapted their personal state constitution, and in that constitution, they rejected slavery. They did not want slavery. This sort of made the Southerners confused. First of all, they believed that the Missouri Compromise had said that California should be a slave state. They are confused why California wouldn't be open to slavery, as it fell underneath the Missouri Compromise. The issue is that President Taylor, now we remember Taylor being a general during the War of Mexico. Now he ends up being the president. He is sort of the next elected after Polk. He actually supports California being a free state. The reason is that he believes each new state that develops should have the choice to decide for themselves whether they would like to be a slave state or a free state. He also believed that if the South forced California to be a slave state, that California may sort of have some issues with joining America in general. The South, though, did not really agree with how President Taylor did this. The South actually saw this as sort of an attack on the Southern way of life. Because of this issue, the statehood for California, we start seeing that the Southern states who are slave states are now starting to think about leaving the USA and the Union and becoming their own country. There are quite a few debates over this issue. So in the winter of 1850, we have a lot of mistrust or distrust between the North and the South. There are many sort of different issues that need to be solved. The first thing is Texas borders. Now Texas believes that part of New Mexico should fall under Texas and should be part of the slave state. The other thing is that the North wanted to end slavery completely. They are saying that the South should have no more slaves. The third thing is that the South accused the North of not enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act. Now the Fugitive Slave Act, means that if a slave were to escape from its owner to the North and was caught in the North, Northerners would have to send that slave back to its owner. After all this arguing, we have Southern states are basically threatening for a secession. What that means is that they are going to withdraw or move away from the United States Union, and that they will be forming their own country. A way to sort of stop some of these conflicts, we have Henry Clay producing another compromise. Now, if you remember, Henry Clay has done this a lot in American history. First, he's the one who came up with the American system. Second, he is also the one who came up with the Missouri Compromise. So here he is at it again, trying to find a compromise between North and South. In his compromise, it states that California will be a free state. This is going to please the North. As a way to compromise, to please the South, there is going to be more enforcement or sort of more rules to make sure that the Fugitive Slave Act is actually followed in the North. So any sort of slave who gets caught in the North, they will be forced to go back to the South. As a way to please both parties, we have this idea of popular sovereignty. So what that means is that in Utah and New Mexico, these two sort of areas gained after the Mexican War, they are going to take a vote on whether they want to be slave or state when the time comes. The last part that pleases both is that Texas, who's sort of taken over part of New Mexico, is going to be paid $10 million in exchange for letting New Mexico stay as New Mexico. This satisfies both parties. Now, looking at the map and also looking at the end of the textbook, does this compromise satisfy both the North and the South? Do you see that there is going to be any problems